Hello, and welcome to this special event presented by the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair and the Holocaust Memorial Center Zeckelman campus. Today's event is in remembrance of Kristallnacht and is a special partnership between our two organizations. My name is Jamie Loeb, and I'm the Senior Director of Cultural Arts at the JCC of Metro Detroit. While you're here at the JCC's YouTube channel, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, hit the reminder bell, all of those things so that you never miss an exciting virtual event. We have a really special event for you tonight, and I think you will be intrigued, you will learn a lot, and we hope that you'll join in with your questions. You can drop a question in the comment box below or text this number right here, 248-973-7286. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what your questions are. Our guests have an amazing discussion prepared for you, of course, but they will get to as many of your questions as they can. So now I'd like to introduce to you Gail Fisher, who will tell you about tonight's event.
Thank you, Jamie. Good evening and welcome to the 69th Annual Jewish Book Fair, the oldest and largest in the nation. My name is Gail Fisher, and as past chairperson of this illustrious event and current member of our steering committee, it is my honor to kick off the Jewish Book Fair, which takes on new significance this year. From December 1st through December 9th, authors will educate and entertain us as we all try to navigate these uncertain times together. Books play a more relevant and important vehicle in our lives today as they help us connect with each other and serve as a reflection on our society. We have an exceptional lineup of events planned, so please visit our website, which is noted in the chat box, to find ways to get involved and support our work. Tonight, on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, we continue our tradition of programming speakers in remembrance of this horrific event in history. The Holocaust Memorial Center, Zeckelman Family Campus, a co-sponsor of this program, has dedicated its resources to engage, educate, and empower the public by remembering the Holocaust. Serving as a docent for over 15 years, I could attest to the importance of education as the best way to combat and prevent ignorance and hate. Our speaker tonight, Debbie Cenziper, author of Citizen 865, The Hunt for Hitler's Hidden Soldiers in America, enlightens all of us as she tells the meticulously documented story of how a small group of American Nazi hunters tracked down and exposed members of SS trainees who escaped to America after World War II. These men, who trained in the little-known Tragniki camp located south of Warsaw, were responsible for the murder of approximately 1.7 million Polish Jews over a 20-month period. Many of these 5,000 Tragniki men, including Citizen 865 Jacob Reinhardt, enthusiastically carried out mass murder. This book provides a close-up look to the investigation, hunt, and removal of these murders from U.S. soil. Debbie Cenziper is an award-winning investigative reporter, professor, and author who writes for the Washington Post. Debbie has won many major awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Human Rights, the Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting from Harvard, and the 2007 Pulitzer Prize at the Miami Herald for stories about housing developers who are stealing from the poor. She is a co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Love Wins, The Lovers and Lawyers Who Fought the Landmark Case for Marriage Equality. In addition to all her accomplishments, Debbie was recently named Director of Investigative Reporting at Northwestern University. Debbie will be in conversation with Ruth Bergman, Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Center. Following Ms. Cenziper's presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. So please post your questions in the chat box and Ruth will compile and pose your questions to Debbie. Please join me in virtually welcoming our moderator, Ruth Bergman, and our speaker tonight, Debbie Cenziper.
Hi, Debbie. How are you? I'm great, Ruth. How are you?
I'm good. We are so excited and thrilled that you're able to be here with us tonight. This is such a fascinating book, and the work was so meticulous and read just so easily. But the first thing that I want to ask you is, how did this project get started? What got you interested in this?
Thanks for asking that. And first of all, Gail, thank you for such a lovely introduction. And thank you for everyone for being here. It's been such an intense 7 or 8 days. I live outside of Washington, D.C., so I know it's been an incredible journey for all of us. So I'm glad that you're here and willing to and interested in this book. So this story got started in the final moments of 2016. Ruth, I was at a New Year's Eve party with my husband in the suburbs of Washington, and just before midnight, and I remember that because my husband was desperate to go, and I forced him to stay. I wanted to dance, and he was like inching toward the door. But I fell into a conversation with a prosecutor from the U.S. Department of Justice. And over the course of a long conversation, she told me about this Nazi hunting unit deep inside the Department of Justice that had spent the better part of 30 years hunting for Nazi war criminals who were hiding in plain sight in American cities and suburbs. And though I had lived and worked in Washington for more than a decade and had heard of some high-profile names like John Demjanjuk and others, I really didn't know much about this unit. And I remember thinking of 2 questions that night. The first was, how was it possible that we were still finding Nazi war criminals living on US soil so many decades after the end of the war? I just could not imagine that that was possible. And I also remember wanting to know much more about the prosecutors and historians inside this unit at the Justice Department who had spent, in some cases, their entire professional careers probing some of the darkest moments in recent history, interviewing not only survivors and witnesses, but also mass murderers. And I really wanted to get to know them on a personal level. I've been an investigative reporter now for more than 25 years. And I always say, you know, I look for, in some ways, the worst in human nature, right? I look for affordable housing developers who steal from the poor, or, you know, people who will sell their souls for not a lot of money. And when I wrote this book, as well as my first book, I really wanted to look for the best in human nature. I really was moved and inspired at the end of the day by the people who did this work, by the Nazi hunters in this book. And I wanted to share their story with a mass audience.
That's fascinating. And it all started at a party that your husband wanted to leave. That's incredible. Well, I'm glad you didn't leave the party, because look what came from it.
There you go. Right. That's exactly right.
Absolutely. So why don't we start at the beginning? And can you tell us about the history of Tragniki and what it was and what was going on there?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a great place to start. If I may, I'll share my screen here for just a minute. Tragniki was a small farming village. Can everybody see that? Yeah, was a small farming village just south of Warsaw. And in this village, here it is, right here on this map. It was just a nothing little village in occupied Poland, but it was a strategic location for the Third Reich because it connected by rail to major Jewish quarters like Warsaw and Lublin and other places. And in the early months of the war, the SS needed manpower because German boys were busy fighting on the Soviet front. The SS wanted, as we know, to annihilate the Jews of occupied Poland, but they didn't have the manpower to do it. They needed boots on the ground. And so they started to recruit 5,000 men, many of them just civilians from Lithuania and Latvia and other places, the Ukraine, and Soviet POWs that they pulled from POW camps. And they brought them all to this small town of Trebiki. And in this training camp, it became in many ways a school for mass murder. These 5,000 recruits were armed. They were given uniforms, health insurance, barracks. There were reports that they were, quote, made to shoot a Jew to prove their loyalty to the Nazi cause. And over time, these men became a roving army of foot soldiers. They were deployed to all of the Jewish ghettos in occupied Poland. They helped deport the Jews to the death camps of occupied Poland. And they staffed the perimeters, manned the perimeters of the death camps, and in some cases, operated the gas chambers. And if I may, Ruth, one last thing. Their first mission was to the city of Lublin, and Lublin had 40,000 Jews before the war, and they were, of course, forced into a ghetto. And for a while, they lived. There was disease in the ghetto, as we all know. People were hungry. I'm always astounded by this picture because just outside the walls of the ghetto every weekend, there was a teeming farmer's market. And I remember going to Lublin and for the reporting of this story, and I could not get out of my head what it must have been like for the parents inside this ghetto to know that just beyond the ghetto walls, they could have found food to feed their children. But one night in early March of 1942, the 5,000 men of Tragniki, not quite 5,000 at that point, surrounded the perimeter of the ghetto. They lighted the street lamps. They forced everyone outside and announced that 1,500 Jews a day would be resettled in the East, which we now know as Nazi code for murder. And they shot the elderly and sick on the spot. And over the course of weeks, they worked side by side with the SS to deport the Jews of Lublin to their deaths. They went to the Jewish orphanage and shot the children as well as their caregivers. They went to the Jewish hospital and murdered the patients as well as the doctors and the nurses. And over time, over the course of this horrific Nazi operation in occupied Poland, these men became, as I said, essential foot soldiers of the Third Reich. They were so critical to the Nazi operation in occupied Poland that Himmler himself visited the Tragniki training camp on multiple occasions to praise the men. And beyond the ghettos, they were also deployed to the Warsaw ghetto to help suppress the Jewish uprising. And they fought side by side with the SS to help suppress the uprising in the ghetto. So these men were absolutely essential to the operation.
That's astounding. Thank you for explaining that. Let's switch for a little bit. And before we talk more about the Men of Tragniki and the OSI, you talk about a Jewish couple that lived in Lublin, Felix and Lucy. And can you tell us a little bit more about Felix and Lucy and their story and why they were such an important part of your book and your research?
Yeah, Felix and Lucy were just kids, two Jewish teenagers in Lublin at the time. And she was only about 15, 16. He was a few years older. And when the Tragniki men surrounded the ghetto and started deporting everyone, they actually had two big roundups. Felix and Lucy hid in a double wall that Felix's father built. He had been an architect before this. And they managed to escape the deportations. They watched everyone they knew get taken away, their parents, their friends, their classmates, their cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents, everyone. But they managed to escape and they fled to the Warsaw Ghetto. And where do you go in the ghetto when you're two Jews on the run from the Nazis? They actually where do you go in Warsaw when you're on the run from the Nazis? And so they slipped inside the ghetto. And there, Lucy had an uncle. And he said, look, if you're going to be together, you need to get married. And so under the cover of night, they married in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were just kids. A woman showed up and pulled the wedding ring off of her own finger and slipped it into Lucy's palm and said, here, you take it. Maybe it'll bring you better luck. And I guess it did, because just before the Jewish uprising, they managed to get out of the ghetto with help of the Polish underground. They lived in Warsaw for a time. if you read the book, you'll hear how they managed to survive Warsaw. And they ended the war in a small village near Krakow, where Felix volunteered to teach arithmetic to the Jewish children. And, you know, he heard one day the rumbling of Soviet tank engines. He thought this liberation. And the very next day, a Soviet commander came into the village and he approached Felix and said, "Who are you?" And Felix said, "I'm the teacher here." And then for the first time, you know, since the war started, he said, "And I'm also a Jew." And the commander looked at him and said, "You can't be a Jew. All the Jews are dead." And Felix said, "No, I'm really a Jew." So the Soviet commander brought over a Soviet soldier who happened to be Jewish and said, "You're a Jew." He says, "He's a Jew. Speak Yiddish to each other." And poor Felix did not know any Hebrew or any Yiddish. He came from a very assimilated Jewish family. In fact, his father used to bring in a rabbi to teach him his prayers. And when the rabbi nodded off at the kitchen table, Felix would flip through the pages of his prayer book so that when he woke up, when the rabbi woke up, he'd say, "Look, Rabbi, I'm a good boy. I finished my prayers." But standing there in this small village, having lost everyone he ever loved, having hid his identity, having survived in so many different ways through circumstances so far beyond his control, he turned to that Soviet soldier and he happened to remember the Shema, the holiest prayer in the Jewish religion. And so he recited it. And the Soviet soldier said, "You really are a Jew." And he hugged Felix, and that's how Felix and Lucy ended the war. And they walked back 80 kilometers to Lublin to see if anyone survived. Nobody survived. Of 40,000 Jews in Lublin before the war, fewer than 200 were left. Felix and Lucy were among them. And so they left Poland, never wanted to step foot on Polish soil again, and ended up living in Vienna, where Felix got his medical degree. And then Lucy had a distant cousin in New York. They got a visa to come to the United States. And in the early 1950s, they arrived in the United States and settled here. And only years later did Felix and Lucy learn that some of the very same men who had helped murder everyone they ever knew, who helped liquidate the ghetto in Lublin, who followed them to the Warsaw Ghetto, who helped the SS murder 1.7 Jews in fewer than 20 months, that some of those same men were here in the United States, living not only alongside Holocaust survivors, but also veterans who had crossed an ocean to free them. And so I wanted to tell their story, not only because I thought it was an extraordinary survival story, like all Holocaust survival stories are, but also because for every step they took, the Tragniki men followed, and Felix and Lucy managed to survive.
Wow, that's an unbelievable story. Thank you. And it really humanizes the story so that we're not focused only on the perpetrators,
Right.
but also on the victims and, thank God, in this case, the survivors as well.
Yes.
So thank you for that. So let's talk about the OSI. How did it get started?
Yeah, this is another thing. I thought for sure we would be hunting for Nazi war criminals in the 1950s and the 1960s. And really not a lot was done. It really didn't pick up until the 1970s when Simon Wiesenthal got a tip that there was a housewife living in Queens, New York, who during the war had served in the Majdanek concentration camp in occupied Poland and had actually earned the nickname of the Stomping Mare because she used the soles of her jackboots to brutalize children. And she lied about her activities during the war, married an American GI, came to the United States, and was living a quiet life as a housewife in New York. And so when that story hit the news, a congresswoman, Jewish congresswoman from Brooklyn named Elizabeth Holtzman hit the roof, called for congressional hearings, made this her mission. And what she accomplished was to set up a Nazi hunting unit inside the Justice Department, inside the criminal division of the Justice Department, with men and women who would focus exclusively on hunting for Nazi war criminals. And it started in 1979, and honestly, everyone thought it would only be around for a couple of years. I mean, how many Nazi war criminals can be living in the United States by 1980, 1981? And in fact, the work of this unit went on for more than 30 years, and it's widely considered the most successful Nazi hunting operation in the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
I remember Elizabeth Holtzman, and I remember when this all came out, and it was shocking and horrifying and stunning, and the fact that they were willing to do something about it. I mean, these were crimes that were not committed on American soil. The
Right.
victims were not American, and so that, of course, created an interesting methodology that the OSI was using. They couldn't really prosecute them for the crime. So what did they actually prosecute them for?
That's exactly right. And a lot of people ask me, did we try them in criminal court? And as you said, Ruth, they couldn't. We can't try people that committed crimes on foreign soil against non-US citizens. So the best thing they could do was take them to civil court and convince a judge to denaturalize them, because so many of these men and at least one woman came over and after a few years, pledged before an American flag to defend the Constitution, and they became naturalized US citizens. So the only thing the Office of Special Investigations could do, it was a pretty big stick, was to denaturalize them or convince a judge to denaturalize them, and then take these men to immigration court and convince an immigration judge to order them deported. And the idea that these men would not be allowed to die in peace on US soil meant something to the Jewish community, of course, but also to the men and women inside this Nazi hunting unit. It was never about retribution or revenge, which I know we think about when you think of, Netflix movies on Nazi hunters or whatever. But it really was about taking back a visa that should never have been given to these perpetrators in the first place, a visa that could have gone to a war refugee or a Holocaust survivor. And it was also about ensuring that justice was done, even if it was delayed justice, and sending a message, to the rest of the world that we will not provide refuge here in the United States to war criminals, to mass murderers, to people who assisted in genocide. And a lot of the people, in fact, most of the people found in the United States were really mid-level collaborators. They were not some of the big names that we read about from South America and other places. But this unit believed that accountability matters, and that genocide doesn't start with one person, and it doesn't start overnight. It takes a whole system and a lot of collaboration. And many of those collaborators were living here in New York City, in Philadelphia, in South Florida, in Chicago, in Cleveland. And this unit wanted to remove them from US soil.
And they were citizens and were stripped of their citizenship.
They were, in most cases, they were citizens, and they were stripped if a judge agreed. This unit could do it, a judge had to do it, stripped of their citizenship. And then, and this was not easy. I mean, imagine trying to identify someone 50 years after a crime, right? Or 40 years after a crime. That's where the historians came inside this unit. The prosecutors could not do it alone. They really needed the historians to piece together the history of different units and different training camps. It would not have happened. They would not have been this successful without the work of the historians. They were just brilliant doing this kind of work.
Thank you. Yes, the historians had a very interesting role, because normally when you think about prosecution, there might be, people who are doing research and detectives and paralegals, but you don't tend to think of historians as a part of a legal team. So can you talk a little bit more about that, and also about some of the motivation of the OSI team members and the historians. I mean, this was grueling, difficult work. They're reading really dark material day after day, year after year.
Yeah.
What made them want to do this? What kept them going?
Yeah. For the historians, it really was in many cases about correcting the record of history. They wanted to be able to understand what happened. They're driven by facts, and they wanted to unearth the secrets that hadn't been unearthed before. And I'll tell you, you said it was grueling work. You know, it's one thing to listen to a Holocaust victim or a witness. It's grueling. But to interview a mass murderer who describes mass murder in such technical terms, that would keep you up at night. And yet the prosecutors and historians did it, like you said, year after year, and went home at night to their wives and their husbands and their families and their soccer games and their anniversaries, and they managed to somehow compartmentalize. But here's the best example of what the historians did, and it's my favorite story in the book, and it's why I really wanted to write the book. In 1990, just after the collapse of communism, the historians inside this unit got this unprecedented invitation to travel to Prague to go through Nazi rosters and records that had been stashed in Prague in the final months of the war. And remember, you know, before the collapse of communism, our historians in the West could not get into many of the archives in Eastern Europe, in places like Moscow and Kiev, because the communist governments wouldn't let them in. And so there were all these missing pieces of information about the Holocaust that they couldn't get their hands on. And so when communism collapsed and they were able to go to Prague, they had no idea what they would find. But this was, as I said, an unprecedented opportunity. So an historian named Elizabeth Barry White, who now works at the U.S. Holocaust Museum here in D.C., traveled to Prague with another historian named Peter Black. And Barry White was 3 months pregnant at the time and had morning sickness, and the Soviet caretaker in their rental apartment insisted that she eat beer and pork cutlets for breakfast.
Oh my God.
And now, how do you do that? But as I say, women power through it, and she powered through it. And one morning, this government sedan comes to pick them up, and armed Czech security agents take them to the archives. They're led out into this room filled with Czech security agents. And through an interpreter, Peter Black says, "My name is Peter Black, and this is Barry White, and we're here representing the U.S. Department of Justice." And of course, everyone started snickering because they were thinking the CIA has no imagination. White, Black, can you not come up with better names? They must be spies, right? But they were not, of course, and they were shown soon into the basement archives. Poor Barry had morning sickness and went to throw up every hour on the hour in an elevator in an air shaft with a chain that flushed the toilet. But a few hours into her search, she pushed back her chair and went over to Peter Black and said, "I think I found something." And what she found, if I can share my screen, in the archives of Prague, so many years after the end of the war, was a Nazi roster from 1945 that listed the name of 700 Tragniki men. And Barry and Peter knew very little about Tragniki at the time. They knew that there was a camp there. They knew that the men had served the SS in the ghettos and in the death camps. They did not understand the scope of Tragniki and what it meant to the SS and this mass murder operation in Poland known as Operation Reinhardt. And so Barry and Peter are looking at this document, and they realize that, if I can just scroll through here, that some of the men are living in the United States, that they had suspected some of these men prior, including Jacob Reimer, who showed up in this document. And so that find in Prague in 1990 launched OSI on this 15-year investigation into the Men of Tragniki. And while we're on here, if I may, I just want to make clear the challenges that this unit faced, because they had to convince a judge generation or two removed from the war to strip away the citizenship of people who look like ordinary Americans, except for their accents. This was Jacob Reimer, Citizen 865, the most trusted Tragniki man found on US soil. They found him living out his retirement along the shoreline of Lake Carmel in New York. He was a retired Wise potato chip franchise owner. And this is what he looked like during the war when he was armed and led a platoon of men to Lublin to liquidate the ghetto and then to Warsaw to suppress the Jewish uprising. And this is what he looked like in the early 1990s when he went to court. So, you know, Eli Rosenbaum, the longtime director of this agency, said he could have been a babysitter. And it was very difficult at times for the prosecutors to convince judges to strip these men of their citizenship because they look like ordinary Americans.
Yes, yes. And you know, that's the banality of evil, right? That was the comment that was made about Adolf Eichmann, that, and you know, Leonard Cohen wrote a poem about it, that you somehow expect evil is going to have fangs and a tail and, you know, look really scary, but it just looks like the guy next door.
That is so true. That is such a good point. Yep, absolutely. And Jacob Reimer was like an affable man. I mean, he's just someone that, you know, had never seen the inside of a courtroom before. You're exactly right. And yet, during the war, he admitted under questioning to OSI prosecutors that he led a platoon of men into the woods outside of Tragniki. And there was a great big ditch there. And men, women, children were brought in by the hundreds on trucks. They were shot in a firing squad by the SS and the Men of Tragniki, and their bodies fell in a ditch. And the next group and the next group and the next group until the floor of the forest was covered with blood. And under questioning, Jacob Reimer said he shot at a man who was half dead in the ditch because he was pointing at his head and begging for mercy. And so, you know, you hear those stories and it's, you know, it's mind-numbing. It's absolutely mind-numbing.
Thank you. So I want to go back to a little bit about the Men of Tragniki for a moment. First, there was a question in the chat if there were any Polish citizens who ended up in Tragniki.
There were a number of Polish civilians. There were Poles, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and a whole bunch of men, as I said, who had been plucked from Soviet POW camps, meaning they had been fighting for the enemy. And yet the Nazi regime was able to turn them into loyal foot soldiers, in part because they gave the Men of Tragniki. I mean, imagine taking 5,000 largely uneducated men and turning them into a formidable, brutal killing force. That took incredible strategy on the part of the SS. You know, the Jews of occupied Poland didn't know where these men came from. They didn't call them the Tragniki men. They often called them the Ukrainians because they had Ukrainian accents in some cases. But time and again, they described these men as more brutal and bloodthirsty than the men of the SS. I think in part because anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, you know, had dated back as long as anyone could remember. And so these men were, in many cases, some deserted the unit. They didn't want to be involved. But in many cases, you know, it was, in a very scary way, they just did their work brilliantly. They really did. Jacob Reimer, in fact, received 4 service medals from the SS. He received vacation time. He was able to go home to see his sister, come back on his own willingly to the Tragniki training camp. In 1944, he applied for citizenship in Nazi Germany and received it, meaning he would have retired a decorated war hero in Nazi utopia if they had won the war. So this argument that he made and so many others made, I had no choice, if I didn't do it, I would have been the next one shot, really doesn't square with all of his plans and his awards and his vacations and things that he enjoyed during the course of the war.
Right. There was a question for clarification. If you could just explain what Operation Reinhardt was.
Yes, it was the Nazi plan to murder the Jews of Poland. And it was specifically a time period where the Nazis operated the death camps. And for those of you who don't know, I had to learn this as well, even though I thought I knew a lot about the Holocaust. There's a difference between concentration camps and death camps. In concentration camps, Jews were allowed to live for a while, often as forced laborers. There were barracks. They were, given some food. It was horrific, and many, many died while doing forced labor, as we all know, but they were allowed to live for a little while. In occupied Poland, there were death camps, Treblinka being one, and there were no barracks because Jews were taken right off of the cattle cars and trucks, made to undress, turn over their valuables, and taken right to the gas chambers. And so that period of time in occupied Poland when the extermination camps existed was called Operation Reinhardt. And, the Nazis ended up demolishing the camps, planting flowers, building a pretty house on top to hide evidence of mass murder.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Were the families of these Tragniki men, I suppose if they were Soviet soldiers, they wouldn't have known, but did others of the families know what they were doing? Was this sort of an open secret or just open, or was it more hidden?
That's a great question. I'm asked it all the time. About 16 Tragniki men were found on U.S. soil. The last one to be found, by the way, was found in Queens, New York in 2018. So he had lived here for more than 50 years, was ultimately deported to Germany. He was 95 years old. And I don't know if the families of everyone knew. I can tell you in John Demjanjuk's case, John Demjanjuk, by the way, was a Tragniki man. Trebiki was his base of operation. It was where he was armed and trained. And so, as many of us know, in the Demjanjuk case, his son and son-in-law and Mr. Demjanjuk himself said he was innocent. It was a case of mistaken identity. He had nothing to do with it. And so in his case, his family clearly knew because they waged a years-long battle to clear his name. In the Reinhardt case, when he came in for questioning before U.S. prosecutors, he left his wife in the lobby. So to answer your question, I don't know how much they told their families or their children or their grandchildren. I have a feeling in Reimer's case, not so much, but that's pure projection on my part.
Thank you. And did any of them ever express remorse or even just admit what they did? As one questioner asks, did they ever say, yeah, you finally caught me? Or did they deny it to the very end?
Yeah. I think they rationalized it. I think they rationalized it. I was just a young boy. If I didn't do it, I would have been the next one shot. What did you expect me to do? They really rationalized it. And in Reimer's case, over time, under questioning, his story unraveled. I mean, Reimer got away with it for years. And the reason he got away with it is no one really understood what Tragniki was until Peter Black and Barry White and OSI started digging into these rosters and records from Eastern Europe. And so he got away with it for years. He was living with his wife. He had 2 sons. He had a pension. He had Social Security. He had a nice, quiet retirement along the water. And I think thought he would get away with it for the rest of his life. And so he originally denied. I never saw anything. I was just an interpreter for the German army. I worked in the back room of Tragniki. I was the bookkeeper. I never saw anything. And over time, with the help of historians and under very, very good questioning by prosecutors, he admitted that he did take part in certain operations.
So I guess the question now is, well, the OSI, is it still in existence? Are they still doing the work? Because the anybody who is left would be quite elderly.
Quite elderly. Do you know, it's so interesting, just before the pandemic, the OSI identified a Nazi collaborator, not a Tragniki man, living in the state of Tennessee. And that was what, 75 plus years, right? After the end of the war. The unit was, as I said, expected to be around for just a handful of years, did its work for more than 30 years. A couple of years ago, the Justice Department merged the unit with a broader unit inside the criminal division that now searches for war criminals from other hotspots around the world, Bosnia, Rwanda, etc. And Eli Rosenbaum, who is the long time director of this unit, is still doing this work.
Wow.
And, you know, I think about the frustrations they faced inside this unit. They faced a lot of resistance. You wouldn't think so. It seems kind of obvious. Nazi war criminal on US soil. Yeah, there's a problem there. But for a long time, they faced a lot of resistance here at home because conservative commentators like Pat Buchanan and others really wanted this unit closed. Let bygones be bygones. What is this, revenge? You know, that sort of thing. And then they faced resistance from Germany and Austria because for years, Germany and Austria did not want to take back Nazis found on US soil. And I think that was the most enduring frustration of this unit. How could Germany and Austria not take their Nazis back? And, you know, just because a judge in the US orders someone deported doesn't mean we can force another country to take them back, right? There has to be a willingness to do so. And in case after case, this unit was turned down, which allowed a handful of these men to die here on US soil, including Jacob Reimer, who died in Pennsylvania in 2005 because Germany had already declined to take him back.
You know, and it's interesting because this ties back to what you said before. You know, they just look like old men. I mean, the guy owned a potato chip franchise. Like, what could be happier than a potato chip franchise?
Right.
And yet there seems to have been among, and you talk about this in the book, Pat Buchanan, even one of the judges, there seemed to be more sympathy and concern for these men than for their victims. I mean, there's no statute of limitations on murder.
No.
I found that, you know, fascinating and little frightening, actually.
Yeah, and you want to know what's funny, what's interesting about it is there's a scene in the book. It's one of my favorite, I think it's one of the most telling scenes in the book, where this incredible prosecutor named Ned Stutman, who prosecuted the second case against John Damiano, the successful case, and the case against Jacob Reimer. During the Jacob Reimer trial, which lasted, I think, 11 days in New York, and he got Jacob Reimer on the stand, and as I said, he just looked like an old man. He read the Bible, he went to fitness classes, he just looked like a friendly guy. And there was one day where he was questioning Reimer, and on a break, Ned Stutman pulled his wife into the corner, and he said, you know, am I okay here? Because, you know, it wasn't that he had second thoughts, but, you know, it's still a human being. You're still facing a human being. And I think that was a little bit hard for him for just a brief moment, but the moment didn't last because he knew what Jacob Reimer had done.
Right. So you talked about the fact that, you know, here in America, where the crimes were not committed and it was not committed against American citizens, we were prosecuting and at least trying to get them deported, take their American citizenship away. Were other countries at all interested in hunting for and prosecuting Nazis that were living on their soil?
Yes, in fact, Canada created a Nazi hunting unit modeled after the Office of Special Investigations. So in some ways, this model that we had here, this office, did serve as an example for other countries. And yes, other countries have searched and hunted for Nazi war criminals. just none as successfully as this unit, especially in recent years. I think in Germany, there was just fatigue. They just, for a long time, didn't want to deal with it anymore. To me, one of the saddest parts of the book is this story about Michael Bernstein, who was a young prosecutor in OSI living here in Maryland. And in 1988, just before Hanukkah, OSI got word that the Austrian government was relenting and had agreed to take back Austrian-born Nazi war criminals found on US soil. And this was a huge victory for OSI. Finally, there was some movement on the part of the Austrian government. And so just before Hanukkah, Michael Bernstein flew to Vienna on behalf of OSI to sign the deal with the Austrian government. And he got the deal done. Brilliant, brilliant young lawyer, 33 years old. And he wanted to get home in time to celebrate Hanukkah with his 4-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter. And he called his boss and said, I'm going to switch to an earlier flight. And he chose Pan Am Flight 103, which blew up in the skies over Lockerbie, Scotland, by a terrorist bomb, and had died in the line of duty. And, Eli Rosenbaum still keeps a picture of Michael on his bookshelf. It was one of the darkest moments in the 30-year history of this unit, all trying to convince Austria to take back war criminals found on US soil. Eli Rosenbaum often said he used to want to climb up onto the rooftop of the Justice Department, take out a megaphone and shout, "Can you believe that the Germans won't take back their Nazis?" It was that frustrating for this unit.
Right. Now, several people have asked why the U.S. was so slow to bring these men to justice, but part of the issue had to do with the Cold War. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. First question I asked when I started reporting this book was that question. I just couldn't believe it. And it has to do with the Cold War, I think, primarily. The US had other priorities. They were busy fighting the Cold War. The Soviets were public enemy number one. And so there was that. But I also think, and was told by the historians, that the Jewish community in the 50s just didn't want to create a fuss.
Right.
The war had just ended. They just wanted to settle down and really not really create too much of a fuss. And so it really took a couple of decades for this to come up again. And for a long time, INS was doing the work. I mean, there was some work done, but it was half-hearted and rather unsuccessful. And that's when Elizabeth Holtzman from New York got involved and really shook up Washington to make sure there was a dedicated unit to do this. And by the way, this is not like some big, huge office in the Justice Department. I'm sure you all have been to Washington, and the Justice Department is this building that takes up a couple of blocks in the heart of DC. This little unit was in an offshoot of the Justice Department, outpost of the Justice Department, in this rundown office with frayed carpet and stained drop ceilings. And the lawyers used to look down and see rats run across the tips of their shoes. And they were on this shoestring budget with lawyers and some historians. And yet they managed to do this work for many years quite successfully.
But there was more of a breakthrough after the fall of communism, right? There was an openness, and they were able to get records.
As Peter Black said, it gave this unit a new lease on life. They were able to, before the collapse of communism, they were able to do a little bit of hunting in the archives of Warsaw, for example. But by and large, they would have to go through all the State Department channels and the US embassies and everything else and ask the Soviets for one record at a time. And they would send back one record at a time. Well, history is all about, you can't build a case without context. Right. So you need to see all the records. So when communism collapsed, Peter Black, who was running the historians at the time, sent his people all over Eastern Europe to see what they could find. And they stayed for weeks just looking, and they came back with rosters and records that ultimately helped Peter Black, who is now the world's foremost expert on the Tragniki training camp, identify almost all of the 5,000 men who served there. He has biographical information on all 5,000 men. And what's interesting about this is that the Soviets, in the years after the war, actually held criminal trials against the men of Tragniki because many of them were captured Soviet soldiers. And so after the war, they returned to the Soviet Union, lied about their whereabouts, etc. The Soviets caught them and brought them up on charges of deserting the motherland and put them in prison and had all of these court files. Here in the West, we just didn't know that happened until the collapse of communism. So had there been more cooperation between the US and the Soviets, we probably could have found these men much earlier than we did.
And there was also a sense, I believe, that they didn't really trust the Soviet records. They just assumed that that they were giving falsehoods just because they wanted to, give falsehoods.
Well, I think the prosecutors inside the Justice Department did trust the Soviet records, and they, not foolishly, they trusted them because they tested the paper, they had brought in handwriting experts to authenticate these records. But Pat Buchanan and others said, how can we trust the Soviet records? How could, they're our arch enemy, how can we do it? And what's more, if we're going to deport men, are we going to deport them back to the Soviet Union? How can we do that? Is there such a thing as Soviet justice? How can we do that? And so they really played up that whole angle. But I think in all the years this unit received records from the Soviets, I don't think there was ever a case that they could verify of any document being forged.
Well, thank you for making that clarification. So we only have a few minutes left, but there was an interesting question that I wanted to ask you, because the book does in fact read like a novel. It was fascinating, it was engrossing, the way it was written. It was really a page turner. And so the question was, how much literary license did you take in the various descriptions that fill in the story, such as the weather or an article of clothing, conversations?
Thank you for asking that question. I would say I took no literary license. All of the dialogue came from court transcripts or emails or the recollections of people who were directly involved in conversations. Every time I looked up the weather, I looked it up, like, what was the weather 45 years ago in this city at this time? I really pride myself, and thank you for saying the book reads like fiction. I really pride myself on teasing out details. So it's easy to ask prosecutors who are writers themselves in many ways, well, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? What were you wearing? What were you eating? It's very hard to get that from historians, because historians, who to me are in many ways the hero of this book, they're very much driven by the facts, right? And timelines. And so it was often hard to say, how did you feel? How did you feel? But over the course of many conversations, I was able to get that. So, I worked with a series of fact checkers to make sure that my facts and details were right. I retraced the steps of the historians traveling to several countries, including, as you can see here, I actually went and looked up the documents that they found in Prague, where they make you put, gloves on your hands so that the ink on your fingers don't mess up historical documents. But I was very, very meticulous about that. And I retraced the steps. I didn't have a chance to show you of Felix and Lucy, who to me were the heart of this book. I'm going backwards here because this was Lucy just before the war. She had a younger brother, David, who did not survive. It was a sad, horrific story where you can find out if you read the book. But this is Lucy and Felix years later. And though they died before I started reporting this story, I've really gotten to know their children and grandchildren. And I remember listening to Lucy and Felix's oral history until 2 a.m. one night, because they were both such incredible storytellers. I just couldn't turn away until I understood how their story ended. And Felix and Lucy both lived well into old age. Felix died in his armchair watching an ice hockey game in his early 90s. And when he died, he had served generations of children as a pediatrician. And when he died, Felix turned to their son and said, "I won't survive 6 more months without him." And I saw that with my own grandparents, so I understand that connection. But in this case, Felix was the only one that knew Lucy's family. Lucy was the only one who knew Felix's family. And in the middle of the night, Felix would turn to Lucy and say, "I can't remember the sound of my sister's voice." And Lucy would be there to remind him. And I choke up. But 6 months later, true to her word, Lucy died. And she died on what would have been their 75th wedding anniversary in the Warsaw Ghetto.
Wow.
Left behind a beautiful family.
Debbie, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. The book was truly, it was a quick read, but it was also so detailed and informative. And anyone who has not read the book, I really, really recommend that you read it. You've been absolutely delightful and so informative. Thank you so very, very much.
Ruth, thank you.
And thank you to Ruth as well. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Debbie, for this wonderful and insightful and fascinating discussion. Our next event at the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is November 29th. The book fair officially starts December 1st, but we're just so excited to get going. We have a few events in November. So on November 29th, we'll be talking with the former Israeli ambassador to the US, Michael Oren, who has a new book of short stories. And he will be joined by Steve Israel, who some of you may have seen joined us for an event over the summer. So that should be a great event as well. You can see our full schedule right here at our website, Cultural Arts. I always do this backwards. culturalarts.jccdet.org/book fair. You can also find a link there to our online bookstore where you can buy Debbie's book, Citizen 865. Highly recommended. So thank you all for being here tonight and have a great evening.